It's hard to believe that it's been more than 10 years since the original Luigi's Mansion, and even harder to realize that there hasn't been another one in all that time, until now. I was a big fan of the original game. Even though it was a little rough around the edges, it almost added to the charm. So I was pretty excited to jump back into Luigi's shoes for some more ghost hunting action. Now, as you might expect, Luigi's Mansion Dark Moon follows closely in the footsteps of the original. The core gameplay is still basically the same in that you travel room to room sucking up ghosts, solving puzzles, and collecting treasure. But it builds upon that bare-bones structure in some smart and clever ways, not the least of which is greatly expanding the scope of the game. Whereas the original Luigi's Mansion was relatively short and limited to just a single mansion, Dark Moon features 5 highly distinct ones, such as an abandoned clock factory or a snowed-in mine. And really, it's this variety that permeates the entire adventure and really helps set the game apart from its predecessor. I mean, you'll encounter new ideas and situations almost seemingly on a room-to-room basis. Let's take the enemies for example. While the game features a relatively small cast of core ghost enemies, it never actually feels small, and that's because you'll stumble across those same enemies in all kinds of situations, such as those in the kitchen who'll use kitchen utensils as weapons, or others caught during a repair project using a welder's mask for protection, and those situations will actually change how you go about each battle. The amount of variety within the core set of enemies is simply unprecedented in my experience, and really makes the cast feel far larger than there really is. And the boss fights continue the trend, with each one feeling very distinct from the rest. But with that said, the bosses here do fall short of the high benchmark set in the original game, which featured dozens of so-called portrait ghosts, with each of them basically being a mini puzzle. Dark Moon, on the other hand, not only features far fewer boss battles, but they're a lot simpler too, foregoing the puzzle elements of the original, with one big exception. For whatever reason, the game's first boss is almost entirely puzzle-based, with a level of complexity beyond even the bosses of the original game. And as a result, it was a lot of fun and pretty challenging to figure out. It offered a promise that the rest of the bosses failed to deliver on. Fortunately, the missions themselves feature a ton of environmental puzzles that pick up the slack, and part of their puzzling nature is due in part to how many more options you have in how to interact with the environment. Unlike the original game, where you could really only interact with things using your vacuum, you now have a lot more options at your disposal. In addition to interacting directly with objects up close or using your vacuum, the developers have also added a few brand new abilities too, such as a strobe light used to activate electronics and the dark light which reveals paranormal signs and restores invisible objects. Taken all together, these additions add a layer of complexity to the puzzles and exploration in general that lends almost every room a sense of depth far greater than the original game. And this goes double if you're actively seeking every secret the game has to offer, including a variety of gems and booze hidden in every mansion. Now, the original Luigi's Mansion served as somewhat of a tech demo for the GameCube, and that included its controller. As you might remember, that game was built with 2 analog sticks in mind, allowing you to move and aim independently, but the 3DS only has 1. Thankfully, Dark Moon elegantly works around this issue by locking you into the direction you're facing whenever you use a special function of your Polar Gust 5000, such as charging your strobe light while still allowing you to aim side to side a small amount. Although this does result in some small annoyances, like forcing you to waste a charged strobe light if you're misaligned, or the constant cycle of activating and deactivating your dark light to readjust your aim when exploring a room. But the controls work well overall, and actually ends up making the combat feel tighter than in the original game. Although I did have some issues with the motion controls that control the camera, as they weren't terribly responsive and even felt a little jerky, such as during the first person segments. It's a small issue, but I do wish you could disable them completely instead of just resigning yourself to holding the system completely still. Okay, that's enough about the controls. How about the presentation, which is something the first Luigi's Mansion excelled at? Well, I'm happy to say that that's something this game excels at too. For one, the art design and music work hand in hand in making each mansion feel wholly like its own place, and the great use of 3D only added to the immersion. The game simply looks great, but unfortunately it doesn't always run great, as the frame rate tends to chug in the bigger rooms or during battles. And while it never got to the point of affecting my enjoyment, it is noticeable, especially since the game runs buttery smooth in the smaller rooms. But most importantly, the game has a great sense of humor. I'll never get tired of watching Luigi react to the terrifying things that happen all around him during actual gameplay, and it's filled to the brim with little touches that put a smile on my face, like the squeaking sound Toad makes with every step. Really, the attention to detail throughout the entire experience never ceased to impress me. And that basically describes my overall experience with Dark Moon single player mode. It's simply a joy end to end, which is realized through a constant supply of smart puzzles, new mechanics, and an unwavering attention to detail. It not only retains the gameplay and personality that made the original game great, but improves upon it in many ways. Which is why I'm giving the single player 4.5 stars out of 5. But that's not all, as Luigi's Mansion Dark Moon also features a multiplayer mode called Scarescraper that's available for both local and online play. It features 3 different multiplayer modes, all of which are based on working together to climb as many floors of the skyscraper as you can, and you do that by completing the objectives within, such as capturing all the ghosts within the time limit or finding the exit. Now, even though it is primarily teamwork based, it still features a light competitive element since the game does rank you individually at the end in terms of your overall contribution. So you still might find yourself fighting to be the one to capture a particular ghost or grab the last coin. And isn't walking this fine line of cooperative versus competitive that actually helps make the Scare Scraper a pretty fun addition to the game. And things can get surprisingly intense when the clock's winding down and you still have things to find. But there's not exactly a ton of depth to it, and while I had a good time playing it, I can't say it really hooked me enough to want to keep coming back. And although you can play the game with anywhere from 1 to 4 players, it was totally optimized with 4 in mind, as some of the modes are ridiculously challenging with just 2. Overall, Scare Scraper is a surprisingly enjoyable addition, but its shallow gameplay and repetitive environments does cause it to wear thin pretty quickly, which is why I'm giving it 3.5 stars out of 5. Thanks for watching, and make sure to stay tuned to GameXplain.com for more on Luigi's Mansion Dark Moon and other things gaming too.